Tensions continue to run frighteningly high on the border between Ukraine and Russia.
For a potential invasion of Ukraine.
Of a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine.
The drums of war are beating. 100,000 Russian troops have amassed near the Ukrainian border. Putin is demanding the total withdrawal of all NATO forces from Eastern Europe. Or else. Is this yet another round of posturing, or is a Russian invasion of Ukraine imminent? How did we get to this point, and what does Putin really want from Ukraine? And with the danger of an escalation beyond the point of no return, how can we de-escalate and solve the Ukrainian conflict? Let's discuss in this video. If you enjoy this content, subscribe and hit that bell notification. After all, it is free. Borderland. In order to de-escalate the Ukraine conflict, we have to understand the background of the conflict and the Russian mindset. The word Ukraine means borderland, and throughout its history, the Ukraine has been a borderland within the Russian sphere of influence. The histories of both countries have been intimately tied together culturally, politically, and economically. And much of the conflict today can be traced back to three decisions made during the Soviet period: demographic changes in Crimea, the changing status of Crimea, and demographic changes in Ukraine. According to the 1897 census, 35% of Crimea's population was Crimean Tatar, a Turkic Muslim ethnic group. 33% were Russian, and just 11% were Ukrainian. However, during the Second World War in 1944, Joseph Stalin accused the Crimean Tatar population of collaborating with the Nazis and ordered the deportation of the entire Crimean Tatar population to Uzbekistan, and they would not be allowed to return for 45 years. This fundamentally changed the demographics of Crimea to give it a solid Russian majority. Then in 1954, the province of Crimea was transferred from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This was not a problem as long as both republics remained part of the Soviet Union, but would generate tensions once Ukraine became independent in 1991. Thus, from the Russian perspective, Crimea not only has a Russian majority, but has been part of Russia for far longer than it was part of Ukraine. Finally, throughout the period of the Soviet Union, there was free movement between the republics, and as a result, millions of ethnic Russians settled in the Ukraine, primarily in the eastern regions. This would set the stage for the political divides in the Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union. NATO and the color revolutions. The demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. So says Vladimir Putin. This attitude has informed the Russian policy toward Ukraine since its independence, and it's clear why. The Ukraine, with its flat, open lands, has been a highway for invading armies throughout Russian history, from the armies of Napoleon to the German Imperial Army and the Nazi armies of Adolf Hitler. Russia has therefore prioritized keeping Ukraine as a buffer state from hostile military forces from the West. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, it inherited over 3,000 nuclear weapons from the Soviet nuclear arsenal, as well as the important naval port of Sevastopol in Crimea, which is Russia's only warm water port. To resolve this, a deal was made in 1997. Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a guarantee of its sovereignty from Russia. Ukraine would also allow Russia to continue to host its navy and military in Sevastopol on a 20-year lease. As Russia lost its influence, NATO expanded. A wave of new Eastern European states joined in 1999. Then another wave in 2004, which included the former Soviet republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. While Russia opposed these expansions, Russia was too economically and militarily weak at the time to stop them. However, in the Ukraine, it tried to maintain its influence through the election process. You see, as a result of the demographic changes that occurred during the Soviet Union, ethnic Russians made up 17% of the population, while ethnic Ukrainians were 77%. However, regardless of ethnicity, large parts of the eastern Ukraine and Crimea were Russian-speaking and culturally, economically, and politically oriented towards Russia. This can be seen in the election results in Ukraine, with Crimea and the eastern Ukraine consistently voting for pro-Russian candidates, while the western Ukraine voted, broadly speaking, for pro-Western candidates. Pro-Russian parties regularly won around a third of the national vote. In the 2004 presidential election, pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych won the election against pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko with 49% to Yushchenko's 46%. However, observers noted that between the first and second round of the election, there were dramatic increases in turnout in Yanukovych's strongholds in the eastern Ukraine, but not in the west, with some areas showing a turnout of 127%, suggesting electoral fraud. On top of that, Viktor Yushchenko had been poisoned by the Russians. Millions of Ukrainians marched onto the streets in what became known as the Orange Revolution, which led the Supreme Court to cancel the result and hold a rerun the next month, resulting in Yushchenko winning by 52% to Yanukovych's 44%. Russia hoped that by getting a pro-Russian president elected, they could keep Ukraine out of NATO's orbit. For the time being, they were unsuccessful. 2008 is the year when the trouble really started. At its April 2008 summit, NATO issued a statement that declared that Georgia and Ukraine would become members of NATO. Russia saw this as a direct threat to its national security, and this was the starting point of Russia's aggression both in Ukraine and Georgia. 4 months after the declaration, Russian forces invaded Georgia, seizing the ethnic minority regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Despite this, NATO expansion continued, with Croatia and Albania joining in 2009. At the same time, the EU unveiled its Eastern Partnership Initiative to help countries like Ukraine integrate into the EU's economy and perhaps eventually join the EU. The United States also began to fund many pro-Western NGOs inside Ukraine, including those opposed to Viktor Yanukovych. This triple package of NATO expansion, EU enlargement, and funding of pro-Western NGOs angered Putin, and he felt that it was only a matter of time before Western military forces would be on Russia's border. But Putin's fears were temporarily soothed when in 2010 Viktor Yanukovych was democratically elected, this time without rigging, with 49% to Yulia Tymoshenko's 45%. But this would not last. The Euromaidan Revolution. In November 2013, President Yanukovych rejected an association agreement with the EU and chose a $15 billion deal with Russia instead. At the time, around 49% of Ukrainians were in favor of the deal with the EU, with 31% against. This decision led to mass protests by the pro-Western opposition that quickly escalated into violent riots. This was known as the Euromaidan Revolution. Yanukovych responded with a brutal police crackdown, resulting in the deaths of over 100 protesters. The protests continued for 3 months until February 21st, 2014, when the government and the opposition struck a deal that allowed Yanukovych to stay in power until early elections were held that same year. But the deal immediately fell apart, and fearing for his life, Yanukovych fled to Russia the next day. In what was effectively a coup, pro-Western anti-Russia politicians took over the government after Yanukovych fled. This new government included 4 high-ranking politicians who belonged to ultra-nationalist fascist groups. The new parliament passed a bill to overturn Ukraine's language law that allows for the use of minority languages at the regional level, such as Russian, Moldovan, and Hungarian. What's more is that high-ranking American officials, including Republican Senator John McCain, were on the ground organizing the protests, and leaked audio from Victoria Nuland, the US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, showed that she had advocated regime change and specifically wanted the Ukrainian politician Arseniy Yatsenyuk to become prime minister in the new government, which he did. In other words, the 2014 revolution in Ukraine, while it did enjoy a significant amount of grassroots support, was in part a US-backed coup to oust the pro-Russian but democratically elected, albeit very corrupt, President Viktor Yanukovych. The Western-backed coup alarmed Putin, who now saw Ukraine's NATO membership as inevitable, and on the 23rd of February, 2 days after Yanukovych fled the country, pro-Russia demonstrations were organized in Crimea. On the 27th, soldiers in unmarked uniforms took control of the Crimean parliament and key government installations. These soldiers were of course Russian, and they did not invade Crimea because they were already there because of Russia's military base at Sevastopol. On the 16th of March 2014, a referendum was held in which 97% of the people voted to join Russia. 2 days later, Crimea formally joined the Russian Federation. Russia had effectively taken control of Crimea without firing a single shot. While there were irregularities during the referendum, the result did reflect public opinion. Polls taken in the years before the annexation showed that 2/3 of Crimeans wanted to join Russia. This isn't all too surprising given the fact that Crimea is 65% Russian, 12% Crimean Tatar, and only 15% Ukrainian. Polls taken after the annexation also show that 73% prefer Russia to Ukraine. Nevertheless, it represented an illegal action and a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. Putin then began putting massive pressure on the Ukrainian government not to side with the West. He began funding and supplying Russian separatists in the Russian-majority provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, collectively known as the Donbas region. Putin threatened to invade Ukraine if it cracked down on the separatists. On top of that, Russia jacked up the price of natural gas being exported to Ukraine, putting further pressure on the government. While Crimea was annexed relatively peacefully, since 2014 there's been an ongoing civil war in the Donbas that continues to this day and has taken the lives of up to 14,000 people. So why the heavy-handed response? Why did Russia respond so aggressively to Ukraine's turn to the West and the coup against Yanukovych? Russia's Cuba. In 1962, American spy planes detected the construction of Soviet missile bases in Cuba that would have the capacity to launch nuclear missiles at the United States. A year before that, Fidel Castro had declared himself to be a communist and aligned with the Soviet Union. The presence of a pro-Soviet government on America's maritime border provoked a violent and aggressive reaction from the United States. They funded a failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs. They tried to assassinate Fidel Castro 632 times. They imposed sanctions that last to this day, and they imposed a naval blockade on Cuba in order to prevent Soviet nuclear missiles from reaching Cuba. This standoff almost caused a nuclear war and became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the same way that the presence of Soviet missiles and a pro-Soviet government on America's doorstep was viewed as a fundamental threat to America's core strategic interest, the presence of a pro-Western government and the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO is viewed as a fundamental threat to the core strategic interest of Russia. In other words, Ukraine is Russia's Cuba. If we understand the conflict from this lens, we can understand all of Putin's behavior, and we can understand why the current approach by the West continues to fail. You see, until the 2008 declaration by NATO that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO, Russia had not performed any aggressive military actions against these two countries. But every action since then has been geared towards stopping these countries, which are on Russia's border, from joining NATO and bringing American troops and weaponry to the Russian border. According to NATO's own rules, a country may not join if it has existing territorial disputes. That's why Russia occupied Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia and Crimea and the Donbas in Ukraine. As long as these areas remain disputed territories, Ukraine and Georgia can never join NATO. This perspective also explains why the current Western approach cannot and will not work. In the wake of Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in the Donbas, the West imposed targeted sanctions on key Russian officials and certain Russian products. Now that tensions are escalating again, Western leaders are promising much tougher sanctions. But these sanctions won't change the behavior of Russian leaders for one simple reason. Russia's core strategic interest of preventing NATO forces from being in Ukraine is far more important than the economic damage caused by sanctions. No amount of sanctions will change Russia's behavior. On top of that, the sanctions imposed in 2014 have forced Russia to become increasingly self-sufficient for the production of a range of goods, which has made them less vulnerable to future sanctions. Okay, so maybe sanctions don't work, but what about military support? The US and other NATO countries are increasingly arming Ukraine to prepare for a possible Russian invasion. Some have even suggested that the West should militarily intervene if Russia were to invade. But this again misses the point. Not only does it confirm in the minds of the Russian elite their suspicions of Western aggressive intentions, it misses a key point: willingness to fight. Ukraine is part of Russia's core strategic interest, and it is willing to go to war for it. The West is not. The US eagerly supported regime change in 2014, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to the United States, Germany or France if Ukraine joins NATO or not, but it does matter to Russia. Ukraine is far more important to Russia than it is to the West. The danger of the rhetoric on both sides is what it will do for Ukraine. In 2008, after the NATO declaration, Georgian leaders who were confident of NATO support cracked down on the separatists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. This triggered a Russian invasion in support of the separatists, and when the Georgians needed help, NATO was nowhere to be found. In other words, the constant saber-rattling and arms sales to Ukraine encourages Ukrainians to play tough with Russia, thinking that they will have NATO backing. But the truth is that no American, no German, and no Frenchman will die for Ukraine. And so such a policy will in the end leave Ukraine wrecked. Worse still, if the West does choose to intervene on behalf of Ukraine, the consequences could be catastrophic. Open conflict with Russia, a nuclear-armed state, could trigger a nuclear holocaust. But even severe non-military escalation could produce serious unintended consequences. The US has said that if Russia invades, they will cut Russia off from SWIFT. SWIFT is what banks all around the world use to facilitate transactions between each other. Cutting Russia off from SWIFT would cut off Russian banks from the international financial system, imploding the Russian economy. Russia has already stated that if this happens, that they will view it as a declaration of war. In such a scenario, Russia would most likely retaliate by cutting Europe off from gas. Europe is dependent for 40% of its gas supply from Russia. If this happened in the middle of winter, it would cause energy prices to skyrocket and cause millions to freeze. While Russia would also pay the price for this, they have enough reserves to maintain such an embargo for at least 3 months. So how do we prevent this escalation? How can we de-escalate and resolve the conflict now that we understand Russia's perspective? Finlandization. There will be no Russian invasion of Ukraine. A full-scale invasion and occupation of the country would be too costly and bring no serious material benefit to Russia or its elites. However, there are economic interests at work behind Putin's provocations. The escalation with Ukraine has led to a surge in energy prices and therefore windfall profits for Russian energy companies controlled by Putin's oligarchy. While the military standoff benefits defense contractors from both the Russian and American military-industrial complex. On top of that, the idea of a foreign threat allows Putin to distract from his falling approval ratings at home. Putin's strategy is to continue wrecking Ukraine by arming separatists and applying continual economic pressure on the country, until he is sure that it will not become a military outpost for NATO. Putin's demands in the recent negotiations reflect this. He demanded a return to the status quo in 1997. In other words, a complete withdrawal of NATO forces from Eastern Europe. While these demands are extreme and unrealistic, they are a maximalist negotiating position. Therefore, the solution to the Ukraine crisis must be focused on this aspect of NATO accession. In 1939, the USSR under Stalin invaded Finland. While the Finns fought heroically, they knew that they could not resist forever and ceded lands to the Soviet Union. In 1941, they then allied with Germany to invade the Soviet Union to retake those lands. When Germany started losing the war, fearing another invasion, Finland struck a deal with the Soviets. Not only did they cede the lands from 1939, but they agreed to become a neutral country, refusing to join NATO or the European Economic Community. Through enforced neutrality, Finland was able to maintain its sovereignty in the face of Soviet aggression and build a vibrant social democracy, creating one of the highest standards of living for its people. To this day, Finland has not joined NATO. This process was known as Finlandization. A similar arrangement could work for Ukraine. The Finlandization of Ukraine would involve 4 policies. NATO and the EU explicitly stating that Ukraine will not be allowed to join these organizations. An economic rescue plan for Ukraine that involves the EU, the IMF, and Russia. An end to US funding for NGOs inside Ukraine. And a guarantee of minority rights within Ukraine, including language rights for the Russian minority. In exchange, Russia would withdraw its troops from the Donbass, agree to stop supporting the separatists, stop intervening in Ukrainian elections, and not perform military exercises near the Ukrainian border. Ukraine would remain as a neutral country, pursuing economic relations with both the European Union and the Russian-dominated Eurasian Economic Union. Admittedly, this solution would require expert diplomacy and could only be achieved through a slow process of tit-for-tat de-escalation. For example, a withdrawal of US military advisors from Ukraine in exchange for a withdrawal of Russian forces from areas near the border, a suspension of arms sales to Ukraine in exchange for a suspension of weapon supplies to the Donbass rebels, and so on and so forth, slowly de-escalating until both sides can implement the meat of this proposal. But what about Ukrainian sovereignty, I hear you saying? Surely Ukraine as a sovereign nation has the right to choose which military alliances and which economic blocs it joins, free from foreign intervention. Well, yes, on paper. But Cuba also had the right to join whichever military alliance and choose whichever economic system it wanted, but that did not stop the United States from invading and blockading Cuba and sanctioning it for 60 years. Unfortunately, nations like Cuba and Ukraine are at the mercy of imperialist powers like the United States and Russia. Alas, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. So think about it. The current path has only led to the destruction of Ukraine and the loss of its sovereignty over Crimea and the Donbass. While the Finlandization of Ukraine would restrict some of its options, it would lead to a net gain in sovereignty by re-establishing control over lost regions and allowing Ukraine to pursue economic relations with both the EU and Russia, thereby appeasing both the pro-Western and pro-Russian populations in the country. Finding a solution to the Ukraine conflict would not only benefit Ukraine, but it would benefit the West as well. With America's reorientation to the East and determination to contain a rising China, it needs allies. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China were in an alliance of convenience, but this broke down. Then in the 1970s, the United States normalized relations with China, thereby isolating the Soviet Union. Today, the hostility between Russia and the West has driven Russia into an alliance of convenience with China once more. But this is a fragile alliance with continuing tensions between the two nations. If we can de-escalate the Ukraine conflict, we can normalize relations with Russia and in the long term have a strategic partner against China. The Finlandization of Ukraine is not necessarily the most realistic option, nor is it even such a good solution, but the current path is clearly not working, making it the least bad alternative. We need to get Ukraine out of the geopolitical competition between America and Russia in order to save it. Because if we don't, Putin will wreck Ukraine. Can Putin maintain his grip on power? Find out in this video. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons including Ben, Matthias, Linda, Richard, Eisenskjold, and many more for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.